Welcome to our presentation today. We have a small audience today, but that's okay. We're going to be discussing science and journalism and talk about some really basic and practical strategies to control your message in the popular press. I want to make sure I can see everything that's going on with Zoom and the slideshow here. I want to keep this really short and sweet. Science and journalism is definitely an interesting and dense topic, and there are great many competing theories that might explain the things that interest us about getting science messages to the public. But I want to focus on some things that are, I think, very actionable today. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about some of the research that demonstrates some of the things we kind of already know and suggest some very practical strategies for overcoming the obstacles we know from the research exist in getting clear and salient science messages to the public in the popular press. And I'm talking about newspapers and magazines with no specific science interest. We're definitely not talking about anything that's peer reviewed. Uh, and I think that this will be some food for thought, and I think it's appropriate to bring up now as the S3 OK project is finishing this final document, the framework. I think many people on the S3 OK team are probably considering how they want to share their research and what they've accomplished with the popular press or the local press. And this today this seminar is really geared toward doing just that, getting your message to local papers and local news outlets and in the popular press. So we're going to talk about some of just these major barriers to science communication in the popular press, specifically summary, translation, and frames. These are things we'll discuss. And I want to talk about the power of the press release, which is something I think people have heard of before. This is a common concept, and there are ways we can use that and tweak that in the sciences for really practical outcomes. First, I want to say that all news stories have the potential to misrepresent the truth or the reality or the evidence, and the research says that most do, and that science news is especially susceptible to the inaccuracy through journalistic practices of summary, translation, and the use of media frames. There are ways that other researchers have talked about these things, but these three ideas I think are easy to understand and they're easy to do something about. So being aware of this can help you control for what's going to happen to your message once you put it out there in the world. Uh, one thing I think is certain is that journalism as a field is not teaching science journalism as a specific topic. And journalism as an industry is not cultivating best practices for better science communication, and they're not cultivating an audience to do that. And I think that it falls to scientists, people in the science and the science outreach community to cultivate those relationships and expectations every time we're in contact with the press. And I hope that this will give you some thought points for achieving that. The first thing I want to talk about is this concept of summary. We're all familiar with this concept, is summarizing your work. You've done it many times in many different ways. Summary is one of the things we can point to really easily in the literature as one of the ways that science messages get lost. If you've ever thought, man, science articles don't do a good job of representing science, the literature backs you up. Tankard and Ryan found in 1974 that 91.2% of newspaper articles about science topics had errors, and more than a fifth of these had errors in the lead paragraph. And that's important because in journalism, the lead paragraph is the most important one. Most of these were errors of omission. In other words, something that the researcher found vital or important to the story was totally missing. Because it didn't make the cut in the summary. Borman in 1978 and Evans in 1991 found more or less the same thing, that omission is the largest category of inaccuracy in news in general. and it's inversely proportionate to the length of the story in both studies. So the shorter the story is, the more likely it is for something that we find relevant about our research to be just totally omitted. It doesn't, myself, I studied journalism at OSU, and so reading this research, it was immediately obvious why. And Singer backed this idea up in 1990 that it's obvious why summarizing scientific research leads to inaccuracy, because summarizing is a huge part of the journalistic process. I think it's easy to underestimate how very much journalists and writers have to pick and choose what they talk about with constraints like 350 to 500 words on an article. It's hard to get the depth of a science story captured in that story. So we know, so this is one of our 3 points here, that we know that when you're putting your message out there to journalists about your scientific research, you know that this is going to be a difficulty presented to the writer, to the journalist, and you can help them. You can help this process by doing the work of summarizing your research for the journalist instead of relying on the journalistic process to do that accurately. And this isn't because journalists don't care, it's because they're not trained in the sciences. And I think that there is this idea that it is the journalist or the writer's idea to create the summary and do that work. But being able to get ahead of that and plan for that as you might be promoting your work will put you in a position to get a better final message out there. One of the other major categories of problems in getting that science message out there is this act of translation. The journalist is also trying to take what scientists say that might be full of highly specific terminology or field specific knowledge and translate that into something that a normal person can understand with no science background. So over translation into lay terminology is what Borman called one of the major obstacles to science communication. One way to describe this is that journalists choose words that increase a sense of certainty, significance, primacy, or uniqueness of the research by simply omitting carefully couched language such as appears or suggests. And my biggest cringe when I'm reading the news is lines that read like, scientists have proved one thing or another. That this is a problem of not understanding the scientific process. So another thing to keep in mind here is that the journalist is making word choices to attract readers, to engender that uh, entertainment quality of the news without science training. So they're choosing to represent science either accurately or emotional with every single word. So a journalist with no scientific training isn't going to be able to capture that scientific understanding of your research without you telling them. So this is another thing that you can get ahead of by knowing before you go into that conversation how you want to translate what you have to say into everyday speak. So translation leads directly to this other issue we see with the use of media frames that we'll get to in just a moment. I want to sum up that idea of translation with a really clear concept. There's this quote that's attributed to Einstein, but we don't know. We don't know for real. If he said this, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself, referring to someone's research. Uh, so the takeaway here is that you cannot rely on the mainstream news media to translate your work for the general audience. And that's something you have to get ahead of before you start sending press releases or speaking to the press. And I suspect that you're all actually really well equipped for doing this. So back to this concept of the media frame. I hope you guys have heard of this concept. It's pretty pervasive. If you've ever heard of an angle, like what's the angle for the story or the spin, what direction are we approaching this story from? Todd Gitlin is the theorist who originally came up with this idea, and it has been modified and changed for so many things in the media. I highly recommend the book The Whole World is Watching from 1980, where Gitlin says that media frames are persistent patterns of cognition, interpretation, and presentation of selection, emphasis, and exclusion by which symbol handlers routinely organize discourse, whether verbal or visual. So this is kind of like a stock movie plot or a stock news story plot. Journalists are trying to make their stories into recognizable narratives because not only does that enhance the entertainment value, but it makes those stories more interesting. It makes people more likely to read to the end and feel like they got something out of it. So media frames turn news into recognizable narratives, often to lead to better comprehension. Things like using a human interest angle or a community engagement angle. They might, technology and solving problems is another angle we see applied to science news stories a lot. Economy building or an industrial angle. These are very commonly applied to science news stories. The human interest angle is probably why a big part of why medical science news is so often covered over other fields of science is because there's a built-in human interest and technology and problem solving angle there. So these are relatable and recognizable narrative formats that turn the news into a story. But then we're left with this question is what is a science news angle? And certainly that exists in science publications, even popular ones like Popular Mechanics, uh, but it isn't a very well established media frame in the mainstream. And this is where a lot of problems can come in because framing science news is problematic. There aren't readily available and recognizable narrative structures for science news stories. And this is also the place where the deliberate or economically motivated distortions enter the picture of science stories. Think about news coverage of climate science, framing stories about science as political protest stories, or framing stories about ecological degradation as stories about our industrial complex. Some of the frames that have emerged that are noted in the literature that some I think you've probably seen too. It's the angle talking about science or scientific research as though it's a controversy, as though science itself is the controversy. Uh, if you know what I'm talking about, if you've ever read an article about scientific research or science findings that also quotes a religious leader who's trying to discredit the scientific method as a whole, this is what I would call an anti-science frame. There are other frames include science as an ongoing debate with religion, like I think I already kind of covered that, and science as anti-corporate propaganda. Uh, that has come up many times and in some lawsuits for libel. This is probably the most contentious of the things we're going to talk about, but we're not going to talk about it anymore, so that's okay. We don't know what future science news frames are going to become salient in the public, what things are going to resonate, because that hasn't happened yet. But I think that this is a part of the big challenge for getting your message out there. And maybe the next level thing that you don't have to do this. You don't have to do this as you're preparing, but think about it. Is there an angle for your science news story that makes it more relatable to normal people? I would posit, and yeah, there are other authors who say this, and I'm not going to cite them because this is my definite opinion on this, is that a starting point for cultivating science news frames is the scientific method itself. To talk about each of those steps and try to make that a part of the narrative that makes your story relatable and understandable. And as we do that more and more, we're going to be cultivating audiences that come to expect that, and that narrative itself will become a stronger format. Okay, that might be a little theoretical and out there. It is okay to use a frame to make your science stories more relatable. You probably should if you can, such as human interest and impact on humans, or if that's about the story of the researchers and their adventures as they do their work. Another frame you might consider is simply problem solving. We're building technology. And along the lines of the human interest, you might have a local hero that's emerged in your research process that you can use them as that sort of a narrative element in trying to tell the story. But being able to lead your interviewer to a frame that makes the story more understandable helps them not choose anti-science frames out of just sort of not knowing, or a frame that distracts from the science content of the story, which is what is more likely to happen, that the frame that just mismatches the purpose of science in a way that makes your research confusing. So that's all I'm going to show you about the things that some of the literature that I've read about this. I want to talk about some really practical ways that you can take control of your message. Ultimately, you don't have control of what the press is going to do with your message. But you can craft your message in a way that minimizes the effects of summary, translation, and media framing. And you can do this, I think you should do this, in the place where you have the most control, which is in your press release. And I think most people have experience with writing some kind of press release. I don't know how many people might be considering writing press releases right now to the popular press about their research. I do think that there is definitely room for that in the Oklahoma press, and I want to give you some tools to do that. The power of the press release is a term I've heard over and over again, and one that I have witnessed. You can bring amazing uh, uh, awareness to a topic with a well-written press release distributed to news outlets who might find interest in this. But what is that? A press release is basically an invitation to a news outlet to cover a story. So there's an informational aspect of it and a marketing aspect of it. If you haven't written a press release before, and there are so many resources out there about how to format that, uh, it's basically your news article about your research, a brief one that you're sending to news outlets as an invitation for them to come write their own. Maybe they cover the story, maybe they don't. But the press release is also an opportunity to set out what the message is you're trying to deliver in a clear and meaningful way before the journalist does any research or any interviews. This is what I would call leading them by the nose. So that's what I want to spend the rest of our time talking about. I'll try to make it brief. And I had originally envisioned this as kind of maybe we would do a clinic with this, but I don't think we'll have time. So I want to say that the slides from here on out, you can go back to, and I'll make them available so that you'll be able to kind of do your own drill on your writing if you are considering putting out a press release for your research. And here's my secret, because there aren't any big reveals here, except for one that I've found in working as a volunteer. I'll be upfront about that. I was a volunteer PR person for mostly community arts projects. And I found something that shocked me because papers are not supposed to publish press releases. I was shocked by how often my press releases were printed verbatim. There's twice that my press releases were printed verbatim. They slapped that staff writer on there and put it in actual print. Other times that they might have pared it down or changed it, but a lot of my original language from the press release became structural to what that article looked like in the end, the finished article. So if you can harness that, you will have a lot more control over what your final message is. Like I said, there are lots of resources on the internet for how to write a press release and do the formatting. I really suggest the Purdue OWL. This is great. It's written to students, and they keep it pretty up to date with changes to the Associated Press style book. This is what journalists and internet communicators use to write in the goofy way that they write. Things to keep in mind, real basic. Times New Roman font, no Oxford commas, one space after each sentence. Only use a person's full name in the first reference. After that, just refer to them by their last name. And this format for quotes is really important. To say, so-and-so said, and then the quote and quotations, or the quote said this person, really don't want flowery language there. Keep it very, very direct. Don't be redundant. Don't use extra syllables if you can help it. And that is the really hard part, not to be redundant and not to have extra syllables. So the first thing you want to think about when let's pretend we're sitting down to write a press release about your research. Who's your audience? What are three specific news outlets you'd like to target? In Oklahoma, the most read papers are the Tulsa World and uh, the Oklahoman, sorry, the Daily Oklahoman. And think about what news outlets reach the people that are going to be impacted by your research. Who are the stakeholders in your research? And if you're studying water in Oklahoma, then Oklahomans are going to be impacted by the things that you're studying. And consider that all of these people might be a part of your audience. What news outlet is going to serve you best? So make a list of, I would say, make a list of the three outlets you want to send your press release to before you even get started. The first thing you're going to do is write a headline. 40 characters or less, no punctuation unless it's a question mark. Only the first word and proper nouns are capitalized in the headline. Uh, be creative, make it interesting, but make it true. This is the really challenging part. You're writing the body, you're basically writing an article, a news article about your research. And we've all heard of the who, what, where, when, why, and how model, but this is really outdated. So this is possibly information for some of you. Today, journalists are taught to use the high five technique, and you want to try to address all five of these concepts or categories of information in your first 5 paragraphs with 1 to 2 sentences each, because the most important information is always on top in your news article or in your press release. And the high five is news, impact, context, scope, and edge. The news is basically what is happening or has happened. This needs to be in your first paragraph, in the lead paragraph. What is the very most important thing that you're trying to convey? The next concept is impact. How does this news affect anything? How does it affect readers? How does it affect the world? This is a great place to get a quote. And yes, you can quote yourself because in a press release, the author is usually unnamed. You're going to want to give some context. What's the background or setting of the news, of the research findings, of whatever it is you're writing your press release about? You also want to discuss the scope. What is the magnitude of the event or your research findings or your research itself? And think about that in terms of who is affected. Is this a local, a national, or a global impact? That might feed back into what news outlets you're wanting to contact. And how does this affect the readers of the specific news outlets that you are trying to reach? This last concept in the high five is edge. Where is this news leading? What is happening next? So that means you want, when you're writing the body of your press release, to sit down and consider each of these 5 concepts because your journalist is, and their editor might even be coming with it to them later and saying like things like, you haven't given any context, or where's your edge in this story? You can have a direct impact on how those parts of the story are told by, again, just doing that thinking and that work for the journalist you're working with and in the press release. So this in itself is pretty straightforward. The really challenging thing about using this high five technique to talk about scientific research is you need to do that in 500 words or less. 350 words is really the sweet spot where you know that all of it's going to get in there. Always keep the most important stuff near the top. That's the part that's going to take you some time. I suggest put a time limit on yourself, time yourself, and then stop because after a certain amount of time, you're going to be just banging your head on your computer. Let's go through each of these real quick because, like I said, this is meant to be kind of structured around a drill. The news, what is happening? What has happened? This is your lead paragraph. Write 2 sentences, write a first draft, get it done, get all these ideas out. The next thing you're going to want to do is real simple, write 1 to 2 sentences about how this news story affects anything. Does it affect your readers? How does it affect the world, our state, our government, or the scientific community? This is a great place, again, to have a quote. If you're the PI on your project, quote yourself. But also consider quoting the people you work with, especially if they're good with words. Keep it short. You're going to want to write 1 to 2 sentences about the context, background, or settings of what's going on. Perhaps this is your previous research. Perhaps this is the research problem as it's presented to you. Make it relatable. Scope, make sure you talk about the magnitude of the event, the news, the research, your findings, whatever that is. Who's affected? Is it local, national, or global? Who are your stakeholders? How does this affect your readers? And especially the ones that for the outlets you're targeting. Edge, again, 1 to 2 sentences. Where is the news leading? What's happening next? Get those ideas out as fast as you can, worrying about organizing and polishing once you find the words that you like to describe those things. Wait, I'll go back there. I skip one. All right. Here's another big one. A press release is text, but you can include with your press release visual aids and photos, and I highly recommend you do. Having an engaging photo is the difference between being on the front page and being buried in the back. And sometimes it's the difference between getting covered at all or not. If you have infographics that you can use them. If you have to modify that for a lay audience, do it. If you need to make something different, that if an infographic might be a great way to summarize the more difficult parts of your research or demonstrate your findings in a way that makes sense to lay readers. And remember to add your credits for who created these, who took the photos. I want to point out that your photo can and will color the way that the whole story is interpreted. So choose it carefully. Uh, I also want to make this point, and I don't have a citation here because I couldn't find it. But one of my big takeaways from an environmental sociology class with Dr. Nagler here on OSU campus was that in crisis communication and environmental news coverage, there was found that the way that people interpreted those news stories and their ability to incorporate that into their thinking had a lot to do with whether or not that story engendered a sense of this is a problem we can do something about, or this is a problem that is totally beyond my control. And that the images with that story had a humongous impact on how people interpreted that story emotionally. So just food for thought. If you're trying to get people in communities involved with or stakeholders integrating this information into their daily lives, choose images that create a sense of being able to do something about it, a sense of efficacy in the topic. Think about what your ideal photo is for the story. Consider going and getting it or solicit that from someone in your sphere. And think about what infographics you can include. So if you've done these things, you already have all the journalistic story elements laid out that you need. You can organize, you can polish, and you can use these ideas of translation and summary, and to a lesser extent, media frames, to get ahead of the work, to get that work, that communication work done. So you do have to summarize the boring stuff in order to focus on what's really relevant to understanding at a 6th grade level. And this is key because the popular press is written at a 6th grade level. I would argue that the USA Today and a couple of other big ones are actually written at a more like a 4th grade reading level. But that's okay. Let's go back to Einstein's quote here. This is challenge, but I bet you've all done this before. And think about those conversations and how you're going to do that. I think it's okay to take your article to other people to read, including young people, especially if you have young people in your life. If you know a 6th grader, ask them for their feedback. Ask them to read it and tell you what they got out of it. So again, my secret weapon here, it is using the press release to really control the message by doing the work and making that press release into an article that's ready to go. If you eliminate the work that needs to be done to get it done, you have put yourself on the top of the list to get published that week. So again, here's the big takeaways. Summarize the boring stuff to focus on what is really relevant to understanding. Translate the science stuff to be accurate, engaging, and accessible to sixth grade reading level. Don't assume the journalist is going to be able to do that for you. Frame the narrative in a way that promotes interest, understanding, and accessibility. If you can, I think that's a little next level. You don't have to hold yourself to that. Do provide photos and visual aids with credits. And remember that that is going to be the emotional, that has the potential to be the emotional impact of the whole story. Do provide meaningful quotes. And answer the questions that you want them to ask you. Answer them up front. Don't wait to be asked because they're going to have to think about it before they come up with those, and they might not get there. And again, try to do it all in 500 words or less. And make sure that the really relevant stuff, the real most important stuff goes in the first 350 words of that press release. I think you can do all of these things. You're the best possible person to do all of these things. No one understands your research better than you. I think it's a mistake to assume that even a professional writer is in a better position to do that than you are. Oh, yes. And then back to the framing issue, think about that and be aware of that. Uh, if there is a human interest angle, or can you connect the stories to other stories that are currently happening in the news, especially in the papers that you're trying to get published in? You can, I imagine, from talking to your journalist or whoever's interviewing you, get a pretty good idea of where they're planning on taking it. Uh, Another way to control for this is make yourself available. Hey, call me back if you have more questions, or message them later. Send a message like, hey, thanks for interviewing me today. Do you have questions? Be open, be available for that. I want to point out this other thing about framing the story that is a problem that's structural to journalism itself. This idea of gotcha journalism, where in my journalism classes I was told never provide your questions to the person you're interviewing. That's assuming I'm interviewing a politician or someone who works in policy, and that is not appropriate for science journalism. So your journalists aren't going to necessarily know that. They're going to be trying to find the counterpoint to your point. You can control for who that is by, for instance, quoting someone else in your field who disagrees with your findings or has substantially different findings. And you can suggest those things either in the press release or in talking to journalists of, hey, you know who doesn't agree with me? And that way, find someone credible. If there's going to be sensationalized controversy in your news story, you can keep it within the realm of science by trying to make sure that that's who they're asking. All right, so those are the basics. And like I said, I think creating that media frame for science journalism is a work for our whole generation. And I propose that the clearest path to doing that today, if you're going to start doing this today, is to consider these high five concepts of news, impact, context, scope, and edge as you're writing these. Integrate the steps of the scientific process itself, however you conceive of that and what field you're in, and try to maybe even make that clear in what you're writing. It's going to be a challenge to do in less than 500 words. But if we structure the news story around the scientific process, then for the people who recognize the scientific process, it's immediately a media frame. And for the people who are not recognizing the scientific process as they read that story, it becomes a media frame. It becomes a familiar narrative element that can make the people who are reading about your research more science literate. Okay, that's a lot. That's a lot to cram into 500 words. And you're going to have to skip. You're going to have to eliminate some things that aren't working for the story. And that's it. That's my spiel. I want to open it up to questions. If anyone or ideas, what do you guys have to say? Well, okay, maybe that's a good sign. I don't know if it's a good sign or a bad sign that there aren't any questions. But I will say I am available to talk to you if you have questions or ideas, and I would love to help researchers in the science community get their stories in the local popular press. So consider me a resource. Shoot me a message. And I'd love to hear about your research too. I'm going to make this available on the EPSCoR website sometime later today and send that link out. Thank you everyone for coming today. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I wish you all the best of luck and good tidings as you're out there promoting your accomplishments in your field. Thank you.